clear. Today is Presbyterian Sharing Sunday. It is encouraged by our General Assembly to be recognized across the church in Canada on this last Sunday of September. Now, I must confess to you, when I first heard the term Presbyterian Sharing, that was quite a few years ago, I initially felt a bit turned off by it. Perhaps I have a strange sense of humor, or I have a way of thinking that is a little different, but it made me ponder if Presbyterians are somehow going to accent the generous aspects of their behavior, perhaps we should give equal time to the opposite inclination and have something like Presbyterians being miserly Sunday. After all, shouldn't it be obvious that we should always strive against the latter inclination for the sake of the former? Don't our kindergarten teachers acquaint us rather early in life that no, we can't have all the plasticine or paint or cookies or anything? We must share. We ought not to be greedy. We shouldn't hoard everything to ourselves. Isn't this obvious to all of us who call ourselves grown-ups? Do we really need a reminder to share as Presbyterians or just plain human beings? Well, the answer to that question is yes, because it is also perhaps part of our human and, as much as we might hate to admit it, still sinful nature to forget about the plight of other human beings besides ourselves. And in this seemingly ever-constricting economic world around us, we feel vulnerable in the face of finite resources and feel like we must protect our own interests for the sake of providing for even the most basic needs of ourselves and those closest to us. If not for today, then tomorrow or even years down the road. Thus, if we are honest with ourselves, in the face of diminishing resources, our society generally views it to be quite rational to encourage individuals towards a self-centeredness that puts the plight of others out of mind and even out of sight for the sake of attending to what are more important issues: ourselves, our levels of resources, our investments, and our well-being, which is sustained by them both now and into the future. If we are to be generous, or our resources to spill over into areas beyond ourselves, that tantalizing vision is to be reserved for that special occasion upon which we win the big one, or our ship comes in, or as they say, so that we can have enough to truly contemplate the problem of how to divide things up when we can actually afford it, we think, to be generous. And yet 99% or more of us never do win that big one, and the ship that tends to come in tends to be more like a little rowboat. And this way of thinking and the philosophy of life generated by these competing monetary demands in our life really affects us all. Now, before you jump and say, well, the preacher's being a little overly cynical about the nature of people and their natural propensity to be generous, I just remind you to open virtually any magazine, turn on television to a multitude of advertisements and entertainment contexts, and this is the view of life that is not only being sold en masse, but also bought. The news recently picked up the story of the very odd state of the Vancouver real estate market, which has skyrocketed in value in recent years, so much so that ordinary average income earners can no longer afford to live there, as the land values all around continue to rise. Thus, once quaint little arts and crafts homes built a few decades ago are often leveled for glass and steel-laden mansions with million-dollar views. That part of the story has been known for a number of years, but what is being newly recognized is that this has brought about a situation where increasingly numerous properties in the city are owned by people who live other than in Vancouver. And they are, to them, not places to live, but financial investments, rendering the city in increasing pockets of neighborhoods eerily vacant, with some area homes looking like abandoned portions of the once bankrupt Detroit, awaiting their new grand mansion to be built. This absentee phenomenon is true in many high-priced areas of the world, including London, England, for example, and even whole brand-new cities which lie virtually dormant in China, big skyscrapers of condominiums with virtually no one in them, and malls and everything all ready to go, but nobody living there. Costly condominiums and buildings of all sorts. In short, it is viewed as a better way of saving and growing your money than putting it in the bank. People are expecting these places to be worth more than what they bought them for. Indeed, even the banks are investors in these places. This, of course, exposes only the upper end of the spectrum of the problem of the way our Western and now Eastern culture thinks about money, the wealthier portion of the spectrum. But this way of thinking, as I say, permeates all of modern life. Now, all this, it would seem, is light years away from that portion of the story of the exodus of the Israelites, which we heard this morning, as they once again turn to their leader, Moses, in bitter complaint, as they sense themselves to be thirstily fading away to death. They have nothing. No money, not even water, no place yet to call home, no investments to draw upon, except that of the hope they've shelved were it not for the inspiration of their leader, who himself turns in desperation to that one whose name that they can't even bring themselves to utter, Yahweh, God. And as the story intimates, the impossible is made manifest, as life-giving water generously issues forth from the rock as Moses strikes it at God's command. Now, as an earlier story about water at the desert place of Kadesh, this episode, with all the elders present to dry Horeb, was a lasting reminder about the goodness of God. Yet this wasn't about the people getting what they wanted or even needed, but about something else. It was about their relationship to God. Amidst their quarreling and testing, as the passage put it, they wonder, is the Lord among us or not? Don't we sometimes wonder that? There are, of course, times in all our lives when we may be inclined to wonder exactly that, especially, of course, when life gets difficult. And human nature, of course, is such that all the earthly investments in the world will not exempt us from facing sometimes even excruciating difficulties in life. Hence, the 6th chapter of the New Testament book of Matthew wisely encourages us, in the words of Jesus, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust may consume, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. The most amazing mansions can be nothing more than bleak prisons in life if love and hope do not reside there. The thousands of refugees who have crossed over or are continuing to cross over the Turkish border from war-torn areas across the Middle East seek not a mansion, but perhaps water from a rock, even the smallest hope of a life lived without the threat of guns and bombs and the disease and suffering born of such violent ways of life. And what are these tools of war but the uncontrollable apparatus of greed? The people of Central Africa long not for material things as they do for the hope of lives lived without the threat of horrific disease. And hopefully the generous delivery of health care and disease control systems from generous Western countries abroad will afford them this. Sharing, of course, is the opposite of greed. And while it would seem that there are a few rare people who do realize it, most of us do know that it is better to live generously than to live greedily. Most of us can readily identify with English poet Lord Byron's notion that all who joy would win must share it, for happiness was born a twin. What is our wealth, indeed, if it is not to be shared with others? It's interesting, really. Sharing, in a sense, is at the heart not just of the best of life, but of life itself. The word sharing comes from an Old English word associated with shearing or cutting, as in what happens in the harvest. It is, like thought itself, about dividing one thing from another. And there are, of course, good and not so good ways of doing this. The division between the rich and the poor has been a fact for time immemorial, but the degree and nature of the differences has changed. Apparently, according to government statistics in the United States, the wealthiest nation in the world, I think still, if I'm not mistaken, these things change, 1% of the people there own roughly 1/3 of the wealth. And 20% of the population have nearly 87% of the wealth. So that leaves a whole lot of people who are a lot more impoverished. And as we know, when economic times got worse, the richer got richer and the poor got poorer. While these basic trends may be most obvious in the United States, where they are very good at keeping statistics and records, probably better than most places in the world, they are certainly not absent from other nations in the world, including this one. Now, I'm not inciting an uprising against the wealthy by the poor. The problem is not so much with specific people or groups of people as it is with the way we all orient ourselves to life and what we think we need and have the right to own and how we go about sharing what we have or have not. Do people need or deserve multiple mansions and yachts worth in the hundreds of millions of dollars when they are severing portions of their companies and putting people out of work? Should they at least be embarrassed by their economic apparel, or should they have the freedom to do as they please? After all, they earned it, most people would say. The impersonalness of shareholders who participate in the activities of companies who don't necessarily have the plight of the poorest on their radar is a problem that is not easily solved. But again, life is nothing if it is not about sharing. The Austrian philosopher Elias Canetti once stated it very well. Justice begins with the recognition of the necessity of sharing. The oldest law is that which regulates it, and this is still the most important law today, and as such has remained the basic concern of all movements which have at heart the community of human activities and of human existence in general. The church, when it is at its best, is all about sharing, helping those who are without through the resources of those who are generous enough to share what they have. So the church generally goes about trying to help its members and those outside itself understand something of the good about the things they are trying to do, here and around the world through what people are kind enough to share. Yet in the face of constriction of resources, the church itself has had to reduce all over the place. The church is in great difficulty, we all know that. This probably has greatly contributed to the struggle of the church in our current age. It isn't so much that people are not as spiritual or even religious. They're almost frightened about their material gains and losses. The truly wealthy life. What exactly is that? In the opening of his famous book, Mansions of Philosophy, Jesuit-trained writer Will Durant, the famous writer, offers a tantalizing invitation to consider entering into the realm of his thought about life. For as he put it, the subject here is us, ourselves, with human conduct and belief now undergoing transformations profounder and more disturbing than any since the appearance of wealth. Everything is new and experimental in our ideas and our actions. Nothing is established or certain anymore. The complexity and variety of change in our time are without precedent. This he claimed in the year 1941. But in spite of many changes since, it would seem that the world is pretty much the same today. And so Durant went on about his task in his mansion of thinking, exploring all the rooms of the great philosophical thinkers of centuries past, aiming to establish a new focus on the quest for happiness in a very disquieted age, focusing on the wisdom born of clearing our minds, as he put it, and cleansing our hearts, so that when meanness is gone from us, and we have learned to honor truth, even when it leans away from our desire, we shall be fit pupils. We'll be like those kindergarten students ready to share. Revealingly, Durant reserved a special and final place for his final mention of the wisdom of Christ. And in the end, speaks not of a house or even mansion made of hands, but of the city of our God. I've had the privilege, or the blessing, I guess, of living in a number of homes throughout my life. And out of curiosity, I don't know how many of you have been in this situation yourself, but out of curiosity, I've always been drawn back to see what it's like 30 years later, or 20 years later, or whatever. And I don't know about you, but most often I've been quite disappointed. You can tell when you go back to that old home, there's something critical missing. The real worthwhile investment in them is not there anymore. But what my family and I had in our hearts as we moved on in the course of our lives was still with us, in spirit and in truth. Indeed, Christ's house is a spiritual house, not made of human hands, but born of nothing less than love. And as his mind is in us, so can we share something of the room in his mansion for others in need.